In the frozen trenches, in the basements of Stalingrad, and in the burning ruins of Berlin, the German soldiers kept for decades a heavy silence. Only in old age, with death near, did they dare to confess what they had seen, done, and kept quiet. Their memories are not tales of glory, but late confessions, hunger, fear, crimes, broken obedience, and the certainty of having served a lost cause. This is the echo of those voices, a journey to the dark heart of the Eastern Front after the Second World War. The daily hell of the common soldier. The Eastern Front was a stage where heroism was buried under tons of mud, snow, and corpses. For a common soldier, life was not measured in strategic victories nor in speeches of generals, but in hours survived in the trench, in days resisted in a landscape that seemed designed to devour men. Günter Koschorek, a simple German machine gunner, confessed decades later that he never wanted to glorify nor to judge, but to show the naked reality. How a Lanzer learned to live with fear, to drag his frozen body among ruins and to shoot until he went deaf in order to avoid becoming one more figure of the slaughter. His account is a brutal confession that opens a window to what daily life meant in the East. Koschorek remembered that the trench was the only home of the soldier. A pit dug in the frozen or soaked earth, full of mud and excrement, where the warmth of the body was the only thing that could keep him alive. The winter brought snowstorms that froze the hands until it was impossible to handle a rifle. The summer was a furnace of dust where thirst pressed like a biblical torment. The common soldier spent entire weeks without washing, with lice colonizing the clothes and a stench of rotten flesh that impregnated every breath. The bitterest confession was that, after a time, one stopped perceiving it. The stench of death became part of normality. In Stalingrad, Koschorek arrived as a replacement, still with the naive brightness of youth. Soon he discovered that every corner of the city was a deadly trap. A Soviet sniper could fire from a ruined factory, a machine gun hidden in a basement mowed down a whole patrol, a tank emerged from the rubble like a mechanical beast. The common soldier crawled among debris and corpses, always aware that a single flash in the sky was enough for a projectile to reduce him to pieces. The snow-dyed red was the image that haunted him until old age. An innocent mantle turned into a symbol of butchery. The Lanzer did not have the epic of the generals nor the clarity of the strategists. His world was limited to a few meters of trench and to the men who shared that hole in the earth. There, fear became inseparable companion. Koschorek described how each day he awoke with a knot in his stomach, knowing that he would probably not see the night. The darkest confession was that with time one got used to that idea. The future was reduced to a handful of hours, and tomorrow was an improbable luxury. To live under the constant shadow of death stripped the soldier of every project. The only thing that mattered was to resist, to shoot faster, to find a minimum shelter against the next Soviet wave. Hunger was another executioner. In the positions of the Don, many survived by chewing frozen bread as if it were stone or cooking a watery soup with remains of dead horses in the snow. Some confessed to having eaten rats, dry grass, or anything that could deceive the stomach. The common soldier learned to value every last crumb, and when a package arrived from Germany, the treasure was shared with tears in the eyes. But those moments were rare. The usual thing was to feel how weakness turned every movement into agony. The testimonies coincide in that hunger was more relentless than bullets because it undermined the will and turned men into shadows that no longer wished to fight. The mud of the Russian autumn became an enemy as cruel as the tanks. Koschorek narrated how the vehicles got stuck up to the axle and the men had to crawl on their knees, soaked and exhausted. Sleeping was impossible. The humidity seeped into the bones, producing fevers, dysentery, and illnesses that nobody could treat. The common soldier did not always die by gunfire. Many times he did so from pneumonia, gangrene, or extreme exhaustion. The confessions of the survivors speak of comrades who fell asleep in the snow and never woke up, turned into frozen statues embracing the rifle. But darker still was the psychological weight. In every attack, the soldier had to step over destroyed bodies, sometimes of comrades who had spoken with him the previous night. Koschorek wrote that the screams of the wounded were unbearable because there were not always means to help them. They remained behind, groaning in the mud or snow, while the unit had to advance. In those confessions appears the moral dilemma. Was it cruelty to abandon a comrade, or was it simple instinct of survival? The veterans agreed that one learned to harden, to look forward and not listen, because stopping meant dying as well. The most terrible confession was to admit that with time one no longer felt anything, neither sorrow nor rage, only emptiness. The common soldier also faced invisible enemies: panic, guilt, hatred. Many, like Koshorek, recognized that they fired at barely visible figures, shadows in the distance, without thinking that they were men like them. The later confession was harsh. They had killed more than they could remember, and memory took charge of erasing faces and voices. Dehumanization was the only defense mechanism. But upon returning, when silence replaced the roar of battle, those ghosts returned in the form of nightmares. Insomnia, trembling of hands, and the incapacity to speak of the past were common confessions among those who survived. Not all soldiers had the same capacity for resistance. Some broke down. They deserted, let themselves be captured, mutilated themselves to get out of the front. Others sought comfort in alcohol or in an improvised religion, praying among explosions. The later confessions speak of a front where the official morality, the sacrifice for the Führer and the fatherland, was replaced by another more basic: to survive to see a new dawn. Koshorek and others said it bluntly. In the trench, nobody thought of Hitler, of the Reich, nor of ideology. They only thought of not dying, frozen or shattered. The collective confession that emerges from these memories is that the war in the East destroyed the very notion of humanity. The soldiers lived like animals, fighting for warmth, food, and a safe corner. Friendship was a fragile treasure because each day could take away a comrade. Life was reduced to borrowed hours. And even so, in the midst of horror, gestures of tenderness arose: to share a cigarette, to cover a wounded man with one's own coat, to sing softly a song before an attack. Those moments were confessions of humanity that survived like embers in an endless hell. At the end of the war, many of those soldiers kept silent for decades. There was no space in post-war Germany to speak of guilt, horrors, and weaknesses. Koshorek hid his notes for years, fearing that nobody would want to listen. When he finally wrote his story, he did so as a late confession, not to cleanse his name nor to justify the war, but to give voice to those who did not survive. His memory is a reminder that the Eastern Front was not only colossal battles and maneuvers of generals, but millions of men thrown into a hostile landscape, forced to confess in silence each night that perhaps they would not see the dawn. The defeat as personal heritage. For an officer like Siegfried Knappe, the war did not end in May of 1945. The surrender was not a simple act of laying down arms. It was the beginning of a moral and physical sentence that would accompany him for the rest of his life. Knappe, artilleryman of the 56th Panzer Corps, confessed that the defeat was not only military, but intimate. It was the defeat of a man who had believed he was serving his homeland and who ended up dragging the ruins of a destroyed Reich, a divided family, and a captivity in the Soviet Union that extended until 1949. His story is a bitter confession of how the war permeated every aspect of his identity, even after the cannons were silenced. On the 2nd of May of 1945, when Berlin surrendered, Knappe was still on duty, carrying orders, organizing the last defenses, trying to hold a city that no longer existed except on the officers' maps. The darkest confession of those days was that every effort was useless. The men dug trenches in the streets under constant fire, knowing that they resisted only to delay the inevitable for a few hours. Morale had dissolved in a landscape of ruins, exhausted soldiers, Volkssturm without ammunition, Hitler Youth children turned into corpses at the first shot. Knappe, like so many others, admitted that he continued giving orders not out of faith in victory, but because the mechanism of discipline prevented him from stopping. The soldier did not have the luxury of deciding when to end. When the city fell, another even harsher stage began: captivity. The Soviets moved thousands of prisoners eastward, in endless marches that seemed designed to break physical and psychological resistance. Knappe remembered columns of men advancing under the blazing sun with raw feet and empty stomachs. The most painful confession was seeing how comrades fell to the side of the road, unable to continue, and were shot without compassion. The Eastern Front, which had already been a hell in life, extended its tentacles into captivity, turning defeat into prolonged torment. During the years of imprisonment between 1945 and 1949, Knappe learned that defeat was transmitted like an invisible inheritance. In the Soviet camps, the prisoners lived with the ghost of what was lost: bombed houses, families without news, comrades buried under the snow. The common confession was guilt. Crossed and contradictory guilt for having survived when so many died, for having obeyed orders of a criminal regime, for not having had the courage to resist the disaster earlier. Personal defeat was mixed with national defeat. Germany had disappeared as a state, and the men who returned from the East came back to an occupied, divided, and distrustful country. They were not welcomed as heroes, but as reminders of a past everyone wanted to forget. Knapper's confession has an intimate dimension, the weight upon his family. While he remained in captivity, his wife Lilo and his son Klaus grew up under Soviet occupation in Leipzig, amid scarcity, fear, and uncertainty. Knapper knew that every day of delay in his return was a day stolen from his son's life. In his memoirs, he admitted that defeat had stripped him of the possibility of being a father. That pain, more than the imprisonment itself, was the wound that never closed. Defeat was no longer a matter of armies and flags, but of broken relationships, lost childhoods, embraces that never took place. Captivity also forced him to look directly at the propaganda in which he had believed. The Soviets organized political sessions, talks, discussions where prisoners were confronted with the reality of the crimes of the Nazi regime. Many resisted, others broke down. Knapper confessed that the line between enemy propaganda and truth was blurred because he himself had seen executions, deportations, and villages razed during the campaign in Russia. Personal defeat included the late recognition that they had not only been defeated on the battlefield, but had also served a cause that led to crime and destruction. Throughout those years, Knapper and other prisoners developed a survival routine, making utensils from scraps, improvising games, studying languages, reading when possible. The collective confession was that these small activities were the only way to maintain sanity. Each winter, however, the shadow of death returned. Frozen bodies in the barracks, epidemics that wiped out dozens in a matter of days, chronic hunger that left bones marked under the skin. The soldier who had marched to war with a pressed uniform and nationalist pride was transformed into a ragged spectre who only aspired to see the next spring. When Knapper was released in December of 1949, he returned to a Germany he no longer recognized. His native Leipzig was under Soviet control, and he himself had to flee westward to reunite with his family. There he realized that defeat did not end with his return. It continued in the distrustful gaze of neighbors, in the uncomfortable silence of those who did not want to speak of the past, in the impossibility of finding a place in a society that sought to rebuild itself by erasing the memory of the war. For Knapper, every conversation was a hidden confession, a reminder that he had been part of a defeated army and of a regime condemned by history. In his memories, defeat acquired an almost hereditary character. The son he barely knew grew up marked by the absence of a father during the most important years of his childhood. The entire family was marked by the decisions of a generation that had embraced war. Knapper confessed that although he had survived physically, he was never able to free himself from the weight of that heritage. Defeat defined him as much as his youthful victories in France or Russia, perhaps more because in it was condensed the naked truth of war, the destruction of everything that gave meaning to a man's life. Knapper's final confession is bitter. War had turned him into a prisoner even after his liberation, prisoner of memories, of absences, of ghosts that returned in dreams. Defeat was not a concluded fact, but a permanent state. Every time he tried to speak of the past, he had to choose between silence or confession, and each confession distanced him a little more from others, because no one could fully understand what it meant to have been in Berlin in April of 1945, to have seen the Reich fall, and then to have spent 4 years under the shadow of the sickle and hammer. In the end, defeat for Knapper was not only that of an army or a state, but the intimate defeat of a man who lost years of life, family, and certainties. His story shows that the Eastern Front did not end with the surrender but continued in the memory of those who carried its heritage. That is the darkest confession, that the war never left, that it continued living inside the survivors, like an echo that neither time nor reconstruction could silence. Silenced guilt and recognized crimes. In the post-war, many veterans of the Waffen-SS kept silent. For decades, they avoided speaking. They took refuge in phrases like, "we were only soldiers," or "we were following orders." However, in certain testimonies, a different tone appears, a veiled confession, a recognition that the border between soldier and executioner was never clear on the Eastern Front. Those memories, gathered in late interviews or in fragmented memoirs, are the most uncomfortable confessions, those that reveal hidden guilts, diffuse responsibilities and crimes that still resounded in the conscience of the survivors. The Waffen-SS were not an army like any other. They were born as Hitler's personal guard and expanded until becoming a combat force that operated alongside the Wehrmacht, although always with an ideological stamp. Their soldiers swore loyalty not to Germany, but to the Führer, an absolute oath that weighed like a chain. That oath translated into a fierce style of combat, but also into the disposition to obey criminal orders. Many veterans interviewed decades later confessed that they truly believed they were fighting for a superior cause. That faith allowed them to march for hours, to resist under Soviet fire, to sacrifice the life of comrades without blinking. But with the years, the brightness of the ideal unraveled, and what remained were memories that nobody wanted to hear. Some of those men spoke of their battles with pride, the discipline, the camaraderie, the resistance against an implacable enemy. But then, almost in whispers, different scenes emerged. Hans, from the Totenkopf division, remembered how his unit received orders to clean villages that served as shelter for partisans. The soldiers entered, burned houses, executed suspects, and in the heat of the operation there was not always distinction between combatants and peasants. Decades later, Hans confessed that when closing his eyes, he still saw the faces of women and children who had nothing of soldiers. He did not say it seeking absolution, but because he could no longer keep silent. Karl Matter, another veteran of Totenkopf, narrated his story with contradictions. He insisted that he was a soldier, not an executioner, but at the same time he recounted summary executions and reprisals. His voice oscillated between justification, they were orders, and we could not disobey, and confession, I knew that was not right. That tension sums up the experience of many. They silenced for decades what they knew, repeated the comfortable version of the clean army, but deep inside carried the burden of having been part of something they could not justify. In other testimonies, guilt appeared indirectly. A young man of the Hitlerjugend division remembered how, at the end of the war, he shot deserters from his own unit. They were barely adolescents like him, boys of 16 or 17 years who had tried to flee from the front. The order was clear, to apply the harshest discipline. He obeyed. Many years later, his confession was dry, without embellishments. I shot at them, and I could never forget it. The wound was not only having killed enemies, but having executed his own comrades in the name of a cause he already knew was lost. The most uncomfortable case was that of Joachim, a member of the Dirlewanger Brigade, one of the most brutal formations, composed in part of criminals released to serve at the front. His accounts were impregnated with limitless violence, looting, rapes, mass executions. There was no possibility of disguising the facts there. Joachim acknowledged that they participated in acts that brushed absolute barbarity. It was the most raw confession without the veil of justification, because even he understood that there was no possible excuse. In his words, the war had unleashed the worst of every man, and in that unit the border between soldier and criminal had completely disappeared. Not all the testimonies were direct confessions. Some spoke more of silence than of the facts. Oswald, from the Langemarck division, admitted that for years he avoided telling his family what he had seen: the executions in Dachau, the piled-up corpses, the unmistakable smell of death. His confession was precisely that silence, not being able to speak, not being able to look into the eyes of his children without feeling that the shadow of his past betrayed him. Silence, in those cases, became a form of penance. There were also confessions tied to disillusionment. Many veterans recognized that they had believed in propaganda, that they were fighting against a subhuman enemy, that they were defending Europe from Bolshevik barbarity. But upon seeing the suffering of Russian peasants, upon hearing the screams of civilians, the mask began to crack. Several recounted that upon returning from the front, they could not reconcile the image of the hungry peasant who offered them a piece of bread with the propaganda that presented him as a beast. That contradiction was in itself a confession. They had been deceived, but they had also been accomplices by acting in the name of that lie. The most disturbing thing in these accounts is ambiguity. None of the veterans presented himself as a monster, but as a man trapped in extreme circumstances, and yet, in their words, filtered the shadow of the crimes. Sometimes the confession was explicit: I shot, I obeyed. Other times it was implicit, hidden among phrases like, there was no alternative, or it was the war. But the mere fact of telling it, of breaking the silence, was already a recognition of guilt. They did not seek forgiveness, because they knew there was none, but simply to unload a weight they had carried for too long. In the post-war, German society preferred to look forward, to rebuild, to leave behind the ruins. That made many of these confessions remain hidden, relegated to private conversations, to books published decades later, to almost clandestine interviews. But when they appeared, they revealed the dark dimension of the Eastern Front. It was not only a battlefield, but also a stage of crimes that the very protagonists ended up confessing, sometimes unwillingly, sometimes with unbearable pain. The final confession that unites all these men is the impossibility of escaping what was lived. They could rebuild their lives, form families, work in factories or offices, but every night the memories returned, the villages in flames, the shots in the nape, the screams of the innocent. What they had kept silent for years ended up emerging in the form of late confession when they no longer had anything to lose. And those confessions, dark and fragmented, are today an essential testimony to understand that the Eastern Front was not only a clash of armies, but also a vast stage of crimes silenced for decades. Last days in Berlin, the confession of defeat. The last days of Berlin were not a glorious battle, but a collective confession of defeat. The soldiers who resisted among the ruins of the capital knew that the war was lost, that the city was an open cemetery, and that the Reich to which they had sworn loyalty no longer existed except in the broken voice of a Führer hidden in his bunker. And yet they fought, not out of faith nor out of hope for victory, but because they did not know how to do anything else. In their memoirs, many of those men revealed the mixture of pride, resignation, and bitterness with which they lived the last days of combat. Their confessions show the moral nakedness of an army in retreat, trapped between discipline and the certainty of annihilation. Erich Vitor, a young reconnaissance officer, confessed that each day was a desperate attempt to gain a few more hours. Although inside he knew that everything was condemned, he marched through the suburbs of Berlin, seeing how the units dissolved, how the Soviet tanks seemed to multiply endlessly, how the defensive positions were barely piles of bricks and craters. He admitted that his men followed him not out of faith in victory, but because they could not abandon him. That ultimate loyalty, that obstinacy in fulfilling military routine while everything collapsed, was the most bitter confession. They continued acting like soldiers when logic dictated surrender. On the Golzow Bridge, a small group of German armored vehicles tried to stop the Soviet advance. Their mission was absurd: to oppose infinitely superior mechanized forces. The commander recounted that his men knew there was no way out, but even so they charged against the T-34. "We did it because it was the only thing we could do," he confessed afterward. In those words can be perceived the recognition of a defeat assumed in advance. They did not fight for the Reich, but to maintain one last spark of military dignity before disappearing into the dust. The Halbe encirclement was another scene of terrible confessions. There, soldiers and civilians trapped tried to break the Soviet ring and reach the Western lines. The testimonies speak of forests full of corpses, of the screams of children buried under explosions, of mothers dragging their children along paths soaked in blood. A private confessed that he never forgot the eyes of a child who asked him for water in the middle of the stampede. He could not help him. He barely managed to move aside to keep going. The child died in the crowd. Decades later, that memory was still alive as a sentence. Defeat was not only military, it was the certainty of having failed the most vulnerable. In the Zoo Flakturm, a teenager named Harry Schweitzer was turned into an anti-aircraft gunner. He confessed that he fired without fully understanding at whom, that the magnitude of the bombing overwhelmed him, that the only thing he wished for was to survive one more day. For him, the war ended surrounded by ruins and smoke, with the feeling of having been used as cannon fodder. His confession was that of a stolen generation, turned into improvised soldiers for an already dead cause. The memory he carried was not of bravery, but of helplessness. The crudest confession came from those who admitted that they no longer fought for Germany, but to save their lives from Soviet capture. Many soldiers confessed that their only objective in those last days was to flee westward, to surrender to the Americans or British because they knew what it meant to fall into the hands of the Red Army: hunger, forced labor, years of captivity. That obsession with escape became the driving force of resistance. The men fought with fury, not to hold Berlin, but to open a passage toward personal salvation. It was a confession of selfishness, but also of human instinct. In the midst of the destruction, some officers still repeated slogans of loyalty to the Führer. But the soldiers who later wrote confessed that those words no longer had weight. The oath had lost its meaning. The only reality was the rubble, the charred bodies, the roar of the Soviet Katyusha. In the improvised trenches, the men looked at each other without speaking. The confession was in their eyes. They knew there was no tomorrow. The myth of German invincibility had evaporated. The only thing left was to die with the rifle in hand or try to survive one more day. Some testimonies even show a tone of relief. Exhausted soldiers confessed that when they were finally ordered to surrender, they felt an immense weight fall from their shoulders. No more endless marches, no more bombings, no more constant fear. Defeat, in a way, was also liberation, but that relief lasted little. It was replaced by fear of captivity, of reprisals, of the uncertainty of the future. The confession then turned into guilt. Was it right to feel relieved when so many comrades had died in vain? The city itself was a confession of ruins. Entire streets turned into rubble, hospitals filled with wounded who knew they would not receive care, buildings collapsing over families sheltered in basements. Every corner of Berlin was a testimony of defeat. The soldiers knew it and admitted it in low voices. To resist was absurd, but no one dared to disobey. That warlike inertia, that machinery that continued even when there was no longer reason, was the most tragic confession of all. An army incapable of stopping even though it no longer had anything to fight for. The last days of Berlin were ultimately a broken mirror. The soldiers who survived remembered it not as a heroic deed, but as an experience in which defeat became flesh. Their later confessions reveal that they fought with pride and discipline, yes, but also with resignation and hopelessness, that they resisted because it was the only thing they knew how to do, although deep down they knew they were condemned, that they obeyed orders knowing that they no longer had meaning, that they dreamed of escaping west even while shooting east, that they saw children and women die among the flames without being able to do anything. The final confession is that the defeat of Berlin was not an instant, but a prolonged process. Each hour of those last days was a confession of the failure of a regime, of the suffering of a people, of the uselessness of a sacrifice. The soldiers understood it better than anyone because they were the ones who bore the weight of that defeat in their exhausted bodies and in their memories that they could never erase. And when at last they laid down their arms, what remained was not glory nor honor, but a bitter confession. They had been the last guardians of a world in ruins, confessions under Soviet captivity. Soviet captivity was a second front, perhaps more devastating than the battlefield itself. For the men who had survived the encirclement of Stalingrad, defeat did not end with surrender. It began an Odyssey that forced them to confess the uselessness of the struggle, to question the faith they had sworn and to live with the shadow of guilt. Among them was Wilhelm Adam, aide-de-camp of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, whose story reflects how prison in Russia became a laboratory of human and political confessions. When Paulus surrendered on the 2nd of February of 1943, more than 90,000 German soldiers fell into the hands of the Red Army. The majority would never return. The march toward the Soviet interior was the beginning of a calvary, endless columns of prisoners crossing the steppe, famished with their feet in raw flesh, falling one after another in the snow. Adam remembered that in each village the Russian peasants looked at them with a mixture of hatred and compassion. Some threw stones at them, others a piece of bread. The confession of many soldiers was that for the first time they understood the hatred they had sown. They had devastated villages, burned crops, deported entire families. Now, upon seeing those same peasants, they understood that the suffering they endured was merely a reflection of what they had caused. The first destination was the Krasnogorsk camp near Moscow. There began the collective confessions. Hunger and disease reduced the prisoners to specters, but also forced them to speak. In the barracks, the officers discussed the defeat, reproached each other's decisions, remembered absurd orders. Some cursed Hitler, others still defended him with fanaticism. Adam described how the nights were endless, with men delirious from fever, confessing guilts they never would have pronounced in freedom, having executed prisoners, having participated in shootings of partisans, having stolen food from peasants to survive. Captivity became a collective confessional where the line between survival and crime became blurred. The Soviets took advantage of those confessions. They organized political talks, presented evidence of crimes, invited the officers to join the Free Germany National Committee. Many rejected the offer, but others, like Adam, ended up accepting it. It was not an easy decision. It implied publicly recognizing that the war was lost and that the regime they had served was criminal. That was one of the hardest confessions because it meant breaking the oath to the Führer and accepting that they had fought for a cause doomed from the beginning. For those who joined the committee, the political confession was also an attempt to survive. But in their memoirs, several admitted that they did it because they could no longer deny the evident. Life in the Soviet camps was a succession of forced and involuntary confessions. Hunger made them speak, cold made them delirious, fatigue tore out truths that had remained hidden for years. Adam remembered discussions about the war that turned into fights, with mutual accusations. "You knew what was happening with the Jews. You followed orders that led us to disaster." In those disputes, the unbearable weight of collective guilt was revealed. Nobody wanted to carry all the responsibility, but everyone sensed that nobody was free of it. Captivity also drew out intimate confessions. Many prisoners spoke of their families, of the children they would never see again, of the wives who had probably been left alone in bombed cities. Some admitted to having dreamed more of returning home than of German victory. Others, in a darker tone, confessed that they no longer wished to return because they could not bear the shame of presenting themselves before their own as defeated. In those words resounds the echo of an inner defeat, stronger than the military one, the loss of their own identity. The years accumulated. Many died in the camps, consumed by tuberculosis or typhus, buried in anonymous graves. Those who survived learned to adapt. They studied, worked, wrote. Adam recounted how in Krasnogorsk there even existed an improvised library, where some rediscovered reading as a way to escape reality. But even in that intellectual refuge, the confessions persisted. Every book read was a bitter comparison with the misery that surrounded them. Every conversation about politics was a struggle between those who continued justifying the war and those who accepted their guilt. The final confession came with liberation. In 1948, Adam was repatriated to East Germany, turned into a convinced communist and member of the Free Germany Committee. For him, the confession was not only military or personal, but political. He publicly accepted that he had fought for a mistaken cause and aligned himself with the Soviet vision of history. Others, on the other hand, returned with a heavy silence. They never spoke of what they had seen, nor of what they had done. Their confession was silence, an omission that weighed as much as words. In the end, Soviet captivity was a space where German soldiers, stripped of weapons and uniforms, had to confront the truth. They confessed guilts, recognized crimes, assumed the uselessness of the struggle, and in some cases sought political redemption. Those confessions, born amid hunger and cold, reveal that the war did not end with military defeat, but continued in the tormented consciences of the prisoners. There, in the Soviet camps, the Eastern Front showed its darkest face. That of defeat turned into forced confession, that of men who, having lost everything, could only cling to the truth they had denied for too long, between obedience and broken morality. One of the darkest confessions of the Eastern Front is not found in a specific act of violence, nor in a prisoner camp, nor even in the final defeat of Berlin. It is inside each soldier who struggled between absolute obedience and the awareness that what he was doing was morally unacceptable. The oath to the Führer, repeated mechanically in barracks and training squares, weighed more than any personal doubt. And yet, in the memories of the survivors that crack often appears, the unbearable tension between following orders and accepting that those orders led to destruction and crime. Siegfried Knappe, artilleryman who survived the encirclement of Berlin, confessed in his memoirs that many times he asked himself what sense it had to continue resisting. He knew that the city was lost, that the men under his command were dying in vain, but he also knew that to disobey was impossible. The weight of obedience led him to transmit orders that he himself considered absurd. Years later, he would recognize that morality had been broken because he continued acting as a soldier even when his conscience shouted to him that everything was finished. That contradiction became a bitter confession. I fulfilled my duty, but I knew it was useless. The case of Günter Koschorek, simple machine gunner in Stalingrad, reveals the same tension from the point of view of the private soldier. He and his comrades knew that the orders to resist were a death sentence. However, when a superior shouted, "Hold on!" they pulled the trigger and let themselves be consumed by smoke and shrapnel. Koshorek's confession was not that he considered himself a hero, but that he did not have the strength to say enough. Obedience, learned since youth in the Hitler Youth and reinforced in military training, was stronger than any impulse of individual survival. With the years, he understood that this instinct to obey had been his salvation and his condemnation. It kept him alive in combat, but tied him to a machinery of destruction. The men of the Waffen-SS lived it with even greater intensity. They swore personal loyalty to Hitler, an oath that admitted no conditions. Hans of the Totenkopf division confessed that that oath had haunted him throughout his life. When he received orders to clean a village suspected of harboring partisans, he knew that this meant executing civilians, but he could not disobey. He obeyed and then remained silent for decades. His late confession was that inside he knew he was participating in a crime, but the machinery of the oath, of fear of punishment, and of blind loyalty had made him an accomplice. That crack between obedience and morality was the wound that never closed. On the battlefields, the tension was constant. A non-commissioned officer could see how his men fell one after another in a suicidal attack ordered from the rear. He could curse in silence. He could even cry in rage, but in the end he repeated the order and led the survivors to the front. In later testimonies, the most common confession was resentment against those generals who never set foot in the trench, but also guilt for not having had the courage to refuse. To obey was instinct, to question was unthinkable. And yet, morality was breaking little by little, until turning the soldier into a shadow who fired without believing. Obedience also faced personal dilemmas. Some soldiers remembered having encountered Russian civilians in the villages, hungry peasants, barefoot families in the middle of winter. The order was to requisition food, confiscate horses, expel the inhabitants. Many did it without thinking, but others confessed that the simple act of looking into the eyes of a starving child caused them unbearable pain. Even so, they carried out the order because they knew that if they refused, they would be punished or replaced by someone willing to do it. The later confession was clear. They had repressed their compassion in order to obey, and that repression had made them accomplices in the tragedy. In Stalingrad, Wilhelm Adam, aide to Paulus, described the anguish of seeing how the generals debated the possibility of surrender while Hitler's orders forbade any retreat. Absolute obedience to the Führer paralyzed the entire military structure, although all knew that the situation was unsustainable. That tension broke not only the morale of the soldiers, but also that of the officers themselves. Adam confessed that the atmosphere in the command posts was unbreathable. Men formed in the Prussian military tradition, who valued discipline and honor, were now forced to obey political mandates that condemned tens of thousands of soldiers to death. The morality of the officer corps was shattered, and that confession became one of the darkest legacies of the encirclement. The tension between obedience and morality was also seen in daily brutality. Some soldiers confessed that they had learned to dehumanize the enemy in order to be able to comply with the orders of combat. A Russian was no longer a man, he was a Bolshevik, a subhuman. Only in this way could they shoot without thinking. But the later confession was devastating. In the silence of the post-war years, the faces of the fallen enemies returned like specters. Many survivors admitted that their conscience had been broken not at the moment of pulling the trigger, but afterward, when they understood that they had killed men as young as they were, also forced to obey. Some tried to resist that blind obedience. There were soldiers who disobeyed orders to shoot prisoners or to burn villages. Those isolated acts of humanity were confessed with pride, but also with fear. They knew that, had they been discovered, they would have ended up executed. The confession here was double, a relief for having followed the voice of morality and a guilt for not having done more. Because even those who rebelled knew that their gesture was a drop in an ocean of violence. In the post-war years, the tension moved to the civil sphere. Many veterans confessed that military discipline had marked them for life. They continued to obey in silence, avoiding questioning authorities, incapable of making free decisions. The broken morality of the front accompanied them like an echo. Obedience, which had been a virtue in war, became a burden in peace. Some admitted it with bitterness. The war taught me to obey, but it never taught me to live. The final confession that runs through all these testimonies is that the war in the East not only destroyed bodies and cities, but also consciences. The soldiers survived hunger, cold, and enemy fire, but they did not survive intact the tension between obedience and morality. They carried out orders they knew were criminal, they fired when their hearts wanted to stop, they remained silent when their conscience wanted to scream. And in the end, that fracture became their most painful inheritance. Absolute obedience saved them on the battlefield, but broken morality condemned them in memory. Memory as late confession. For decades, silence was the norm. In post-war Germany, speaking of the Eastern Front meant stirring wounds that nobody wanted to open. The pain of millions of dead, the guilt of having served a criminal regime, the shame of an absolute defeat. That is why the confession of the soldiers came late, sometimes too late. It was in the 1970s and 1980s, when the men who had fought in Stalingrad, Kursk, or Berlin were already in old age, that memory was transformed into confession. By writing forgotten diaries, dictating memoirs to their children, or granting interviews to historians, they let escape the truths they had repressed for an entire life. Günter Koschorek kept for decades a notebook hidden in the attic with notes he had written in the middle of the war. He did not dare to show it to anyone. Only in the 1990s, old, did he turn it into a book. In his words is perceived the late confession of a young man who had seen too much. Comrades torn apart by grenades, entire nights of cold and fear, frozen corpses that served as parapets against enemy fire. His memory was a relief, but also a burden. He himself acknowledged that publishing those notes did not completely free him. I wrote so that it would be known, not to forget. The late confession was also an attempt to give meaning to what had been lived, although he knew that there was none. Siegfried Knapper, prisoner in the Soviet Union for 4 years, could not speak of his experience until settling in the United States. There, far from occupied Germany, he began to tell his children what had happened in Berlin in April of 1945 and in the Soviet camps. He confessed that for years he had felt paralyzed. How could he tell that he had served the Reich, that he had transmitted orders until the last day, that he had seen adolescents die in the defense of the capital? His memory was late because he needed distance. He needed a new country and a new life to dare to speak. When he finally did so, it was transformed into a story of intimate defeat, not only of an army, but of a father who lost his family during years of captivity. The Waffen-SS took even longer to confess. For decades, they clung to the myth of the clean army, repeating that they had been only soldiers without responsibility for the crimes of the regime. But with time, some broke that silence. Karl Matter acknowledged in interviews that he had seen executions of civilians and that he had participated in reprisal operations against partisans. He said it late, when he no longer expected to be judged, but he said it with a bitter tone. We kept silent too long, and now all that is left is to recognize. Memory as late confession was also a settling of accounts with the very deception in which they had lived, an attempt to reconcile the image of idealistic youths with the reality of having been gears of barbarity. Other veterans never wrote books nor granted interviews. Their confessions came in the form of whispers to relatives, grandchildren who listened to stories in secret, children who found forgotten letters, wives who finally heard accounts after decades of silence. In those fragmented memories, what was common was the feeling of liberation. The soldier who had kept silent for 40 years confessed that he could not die without telling what he had done or seen. It was a last act of sincerity, not toward history, but toward himself, as if memory were transformed into a final confession, a moral testament. The lateness of those confessions is also explained by the context. In the post-war, Germany was occupied with reconstruction. It was necessary to survive, to work, to feed families. To speak of the Eastern Front was a painful luxury that nobody wanted to allow. Moreover, society looked with suspicion at the veterans. They were not heroes, they were uncomfortable reminders of a past everyone wanted to bury. Only when time softened the collective memory, When grandchildren began to ask and historians offered a more human space, did the confessions appear. The late memory was, in that sense, also a product of a society that for years did not want to listen. But the late confession has another dimension, that of trauma. Many veterans acknowledged that they had kept silent because they could not bear the weight of what they had seen. Each time they tried to speak, the memories overflowed. The screams of the wounded, the smell of burned flesh, the vision of comrades reduced to unrecognizable remains. Silence was a defense mechanism. Only in old age, when life was already approaching its end, did they dare to open the wound. And in doing so, they did not always find comfort. Several confessed that the nightmares did not disappear after speaking. They simply changed form, as if memory had waited too long and could no longer heal. Memory as late confession also reveals the difficulty of reconciling two lives. Many veterans later became exemplary citizens, workers, fathers of families, calm men. But inside them still lived the soldier of Stalingrad, of Kursk, of Berlin. When they confessed, they did so with a tone of doubling. "I do not know how I could have been that man," they said. It was the awareness of having lived two irreconcilable lives, a before and an after marked by the war. The confession was, then, an attempt to unite those two existences in a single narrative. The late character of these confessions does not lessen their value. On the contrary, it makes them more powerful. Because they arise when there is no longer social pressure, when the fear of judgment has lost strength, when the only tribunal is conscience. In those memories is perceived a raw sincerity, sometimes contradictory, sometimes painfully honest. They do not seek to justify nor glorify, but simply to say what had remained silent for too long. They are confessions made not for the world, but for inner peace itself. The tragic thing is that many of those confessions came too late to have impact on justice or on immediate collective memory. When they were pronounced, the generations who had suffered the war had already died or were old. The confession was transformed into echo, into document for historians more than into warning for contemporaries, and yet its value is incalculable. They remind us that silence does not erase the truth, it only delays it, and that sooner or later memory demands to come to light. The late confession also became legacy. Grandchildren who heard their grandparents speak for the first time understood that history was not in textbooks, but in the trembling voice of one who had been there. Those accounts, laden with pain and sincerity, gave the new generations an intimate perspective of what the Eastern Front had meant. Memory, even late, became a bridge between the horror of the past and the need to remember it so that it would not be repeated. In the end, memory as late confession shows that the war never ended for those who lived it. Silence was a prison that only broke with the years when the weight was already unbearable. And in that moment, what emerged was a dark, fragmented, painful confession. It did not redeem the men who pronounced it, but it allowed them to die with a little less burden. The lesson is clear. Wars never end with the signing of an armistice. They end when the men who lived them dare, even at the end of their lives, to confess what really happened. The betrayal of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. After 1945, Germany needed a narrative that would allow it to survive. That narrative was the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the regular army had fought with honor while the atrocities had been the exclusive work of the SS. That narrative allowed the dignity of millions of men who had worn the uniform to be preserved and facilitated the integration of veterans into the new German society. For decades, most soldiers remained silent, accepting that comfortable version. But when they finally spoke, when memory turned into late confession, the myth began to crumble. What emerged was the betrayal of an illusion. The recognition that the common Lanzer, the artillery officer or the panzer driver had also participated in, seen or accepted crimes. Siegfried Knapper, in his account of Berlin, recalled that he had received orders to shoot deserters in the last days of April of 1945. He transmitted them without enthusiasm, knowing that it was useless, but he did it anyway. That confession shows how even in the regular army, not in the SS, ruthless measures were applied against their own men. The cleanliness of the Wehrmacht breaks at that moment. Obedience to a criminal regime transformed the army into an instrument of internal repression as much as external war. Other veterans told how they participated in requisitions of food in Russian villages, knowing that they left entire families on the brink of hunger. A soldier recounted how he entered a peasant house, drove the family into the snow, and took the black bread they had hidden in a chest. Decades later, he confessed that this was the first time he felt like a thief, but he did not dare to disobey. That type of memory undermines the myth. The regular army was not an innocent bystander, but an actor in the brutal exploitation of the occupied territories. In Stalingrad, Wilhelm Adam remembered the moment when officers debated the possibility of executing wounded Soviet prisoners to save resources. Although the final decision was to let them die without assistance, the very fact of considering such a measure shows how deeply morality was contaminated. Those testimonies break the illusion of an honorable army and reveal the harshness of everyday decisions that today would be considered war crimes. Even in testimonies apparently innocent, the confession of complicity appears. A truck driver recounted that he transported Soviet prisoners to rear camps. During the trip, some died from the cold, fell to the side of the road, and were finished off by escorts. The driver never fired, but he did not protest either. Decades later, his confession was bitter. "I did not pull the trigger, but I took them to their death." That type of story destroys the artificial boundary between honorable combatant and war criminal. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht was also sustained by Western propaganda during the Cold War. The Allies, needing to rebuild Germany as a bulwark against communism, promoted the idea that the regular army had been professional and that the true culprits were the SS and Hitler's circle. But the confessions of the soldiers proved the opposite. The shootings of partisans, the burning of villages, the executions of hostages were widespread and accepted practices in the Wehrmacht. Individual memory, late but sincere, betrayed that political narrative and showed that the filth was everywhere. Some veterans admitted that silence was also a form of betrayal. Betrayal of the truth, betrayal of the victims, even betrayal of their own comrades who died knowing what they had done. Remaining silent meant perpetuating the lie of cleanliness. When they finally spoke, they did so with a tone of bitter liberation. "For years I repeated that I knew nothing. But I knew. I saw it with my own eyes." Those phrases are knives against the myth that for so long protected millions of consciences. In the defense of Berlin, another soldier recounted how he was forced to participate in summary executions of supposed traitors or agitators. He admitted that those executions were arbitrary, often against civilians accused without evidence. He confessed that he fired, fearing that if he refused, he would be the next to be lined up against the wall. That memory shows that the Wehrmacht in its last days was no longer an honorable army, but a machine of desperation that punished even its own population. The myth of cleanliness does not withstand these confessions. The collapse of the myth is also seen in the way the soldiers spoke about the Jews. Although many claimed not to have participated directly in massacres, they confessed to having seen columns of deportees, to having heard shots in nearby forests, to having smelled the smoke of improvised crematoria, and the most revealing, they confessed that at that moment they chose to look the other way. That voluntary omission, that complicit silence, destroys the idea of innocence. It is not necessary to pull the trigger to be part of a crime. It is enough to accept its existence and continue marching. The most tragic thing is that these late confessions did not always find an echo. Many veterans died still clinging to the myth, unable to recognize the obvious. But those who spoke made it clear that the official history had been betrayed by real memory. Their words revealed that the common Lanza was not an innocent bystander, but part of a system that destroyed and killed. The betrayal of the myth was, in reality, a restitution of the truth. In the post-war period, that contrast between myth and confession divided families. Children who grew up hearing that their father had been just a soldier found themselves decades later with memoirs where that same father spoke of executions, looting, or marches of prisoners. The late confession was also a generational shock, a betrayal of the image that had been built in silence. Many children were never able to reconcile the loving father with the obedient young man who had fired in the East. The final confession is that the myth of the clean Wehrmacht was never more than a useful illusion. The men who had been there knew it, although they remained silent. And when they finally spoke, they betrayed that collective lie. Their memories did not redeem the Wehrmacht, but they made clear that the truth could not remain hidden forever. That the regular army was also complicit, that the Lanzer also dirtied his hands, that the Eastern Front was not only a war between soldiers, but a stage of crimes in which everyone to a greater or lesser extent participated or kept silent. Stalingrad as historical confession. Stalingrad was not only a battle, it was an open-air confession, a brutal revelation that the Reich was not invincible, that the oath of obedience had led hundreds of thousands of men into a dead-end trap. In the ruins of the city on the banks of the Volga, the myth of eternal victory was broken, and what emerged was the true face of war: hunger, cold, despair, and the recognition that every effort had been in vain. For the soldiers who survived, like Günter Koschorek or Wilhelm Adam, Stalingrad was engraved not only as a military episode, but as a historical confession that would mark Germany forever. Koschorek, who arrived as a young machine gunner, described Stalingrad as a city turned into a tomb. Every building was a fortress, every basement a trap, every meter gained cost dozens of lives. His harshest confession was having lost the ability to see the Soviets as men. They were shadows among the ruins, targets that appeared and disappeared in the smoke. He fired by instinct without thinking, until his fingers froze at the contact with the trigger. Years later, he acknowledged that the most terrible thing was not killing, but becoming accustomed to it. The confession of Stalingrad was, for him, the irreversible loss of humanity. Wilhelm Adam, aide to Paulus, lived the disaster from within the general staff. His memory reveals another confession: helplessness. In the days before the encirclement, the officers discussed the need to withdraw. Paulus knew it, Schmidt knew it, Adam knew it. But Hitler's orders were clear: resist until the last man. Adam confessed that the atmosphere in headquarters was that of a prison. Men formed in the Prussian military tradition, trapped between obedience and the certainty of disaster. The historical confession of Stalingrad was that even the generals had lost control of the war, reduced to mere executors of an irrational political mandate. Hunger became the most relentless executioner. The soldiers survived by chewing bread as hard as stone, boiling dead horses, eating watery oatmeal soup mixed with sawdust. The common confession was that hunger turned them into beasts. They fought over a rat trapped in a corner, risked dying for an empty sack of flour, tore off their frozen boots to cook the soles and chew them as if they were edible leather. In later memoirs, all agreed that the greatest humiliation was not surrender, but that daily degradation, seeing how a proud army ended reduced to a group of skeletons fighting over a crust. The cold completed the picture. Temperatures fell to 30 degrees below zero. The men wrapped themselves in blankets, in newspapers, in any rag, but even so they froze. Fingers blackened, ears fell off like wax, feet turned into gangrenous stumps. The confession of one soldier was that he prayed not to survive, but for death to come quickly, to avoid the suffering of the cold. Stalingrad confessed, through those frozen bodies, that nature itself was the enemy of the invaders. The German army, which had challenged half of Europe, surrendered before ice and snow. The letters that could still leave the encirclement were desperate confessions. Soldiers wrote to their wives not to expect their return, to raise the children in peace, to forget the uniform. Some asked forgiveness for what they had done in Russia, confessing in a few lines crimes or looting. Others simply recounted the hunger, the cold, the certainty of death. Those letters, preserved in archives, are historical confessions of a generation conscious that it had been sent to die in vain. Every word written in those trembling papers is a moral testament against the regime that had condemned them. The Soviet encirclement was the confirmation of that collective confession. When the ring closed around the Sixth Army in November of 1942, defeat was sealed. Paulus requested authorization to withdraw. Hitler responded with his obsession of turning Stalingrad into a fortress that had to resist at all costs. Adam confessed that in those days a sepulchral silence settled in headquarters. Everyone knew they were condemned, but no one dared to say it aloud. That was the most terrible historical confession. An entire army trapped by the cowardice of its political commanders and the absolute obedience of its military leaders. When surrender finally came, on the 2nd of February of 1943, what remained of the Sixth Army was a shadow of what it had been. Of the more than 250,000 men who entered the battle, barely some 90,000 fell prisoner, and of them fewer than 6,000 would return to Germany years later. The final confession of Stalingrad was statistical, a massacre that revealed the madness of a regime and the uselessness of blind obedience. But it was also personal. Every soldier who survived carried the memory of having been at the point where German ambition was broken. For Germany, Stalingrad was a historical confession in another sense. It revealed to the world that the Reich could be defeated. The propaganda of invincibility collapsed in a single blow. The Allies understood it as a signal that the war could be won. The Soviets celebrated it as the beginning of victory. And the Germans, even in the streets of Berlin, felt it as a betrayal of history. They had been educated to believe that Germany would never lose, and now they saw columns of wounded returning, farewell letters, and the news of an entire army annihilated.